dead dock, and a girl in chains. The port of Breaker's Key was a place where hope rusted as fast as metal ships came here to die, or to hide men came here to forget, and sometimes to sell the last pieces of their souls under flickering lights and sour air. The sky above the quay was brown with dust from burnt fuel, and the smell of hot oil never left the throat. Jax Mercer walked through the crowd with the loose stride of someone who had nothing left to lose and no time to show it. He had worked this port for 5 long years, running salvage jobs, trading scrap for food, and fixing engines that should have been buried a decade ago. He had one dream left: his ship, Kestrel, a patchwork freighter that flew only because Jax knew how to beg broken things to move. He owed credits to men who smiled too wide, and his hands were full of old scars from promises that bit back. That night, a trader from the Rim staggered into the port office with 2 guards in a cage. Jax was there because the trader owed him for repairs on a leaking reactor. Jax wanted his pay, not excuses. The trader's voice shook with false charm as he said he could not pay in credits but had something better. He gestured to the cage. Inside sat a small figure, wrapped in gray cloth chains around her wrists and ankles. Her eyes were bright silver and far too calm for a slave. Jax felt anger burn under his ribs. The trader said she was alien property taken from a failed contract and could be used or sold. For profit, Jax almost walked away. He had seen worse and learned that interfering could mean your own death. But when the girl looked up through the bars and whispered a single word, "Please," his feet froze. He told the trader he would take the deal, not because he wanted her, but because he refused to let her be handed to the brothels or the pits. He signed the slate with a shaking hand, and the trader left laughing. Jax cut the locks himself and told her she was free now. The girl did not run. She stood and bowed with grace that made the rusted room feel wrong. She said her name was Lyra, her voice soft but steady, and thanked him as if he were a knight from an old story. Jax frowned. He was no knight. He was a man in debt and dirt. He told. Her freedom meant she could go wherever she wanted. She asked to stay until the next jump and offered to help with the ship. He shrugged and said fine. On Kestrel she moved like someone who had lived among stars. Her fingers traced the panels, and she hummed in a language that made the lights flicker. Jax caught her staring at the stars outside the viewport, not with fear, but with longing. She carried a small metal shard, no larger than a coin, covered in glowing lines. Jax asked about it, and she said it was just a memory charm from her homeworld. He tried scanning it once out of habit, and the console glitched, showing an encrypted pattern his systems could not read. He muttered something about rich tech and left it alone. Later that night, the dock shook with noise, ships landing fast, voices shouting, search parties running through the alleys. Someone had lost something valuable. Jax's gut told him what. The port security loudspeakers warned of fugitives, dangerous property escaped. From private custody, he saw shadowed shapes moving with scanners sweeping the bays. He cursed under his breath and told Lyra to keep low. They hid under the belly of Kestrel between leaking fuel lines and the old landing struts. The air was thick and hot. Lyra stayed silent. Her breathing calmed. Jax felt sweat run down his neck. He could hear the boots passing close and the hum of scanners over metal. The men moved on after a while. Jax waited a few more heartbeats before whispering that they were leaving at dawn. When he looked at Lyra again, her eyes caught the faint red of the warning lights, and for a second he thought he saw something behind them, something ancient and proud. She asked why he helped a stranger. He said because no one helped him once, and he was tired of watching the same story play out. She nodded and said in her quiet way that she would remember that. They lifted off before sunrise. The engines coughed and screamed but held. The sky turned from rust to black, and the stars opened like cold fire. Jax set course for the belt and didn't look back. On the scanners he saw pings spreading like a net, but he had flown dirtier paths before. He turned off transponders and switched routes twice. Lyra sat in the co-pilot seat, learning fast. Her eyes followed every movement, and she asked about thrust vectors and gravity wells like a trained navigator. Jax began to wonder who she really was. No slave spoke like that. No slave carried herself like that. During the second day she fixed a navigation error in half the time it would have taken him. She didn't brag, just worked quiet and neat. Jax tried to joke about hiring her full time. She smiled and said she doubted he could afford her. That made him laugh. For the first time in weeks, he thought about the way she looked at the stars, not as a lost girl, but as someone trying to find her place again. In the dark of ship night, when the engines hummed steady, he dreamed of the old Earth myths of knights and queens, and thought maybe somewhere out there those stories still lived. He didn't know yet that the girl he saved was worth more than every ship in the port, or that her name would change his life and the balance of power in half the galaxy. All he knew was that for the first time in years he had done something that felt right, and that feeling would not let him go. The sensors blinked once, a soft pulse barely there. Lyra looked at the screen and said quietly, "They are coming." Jack stared at the trace, then at her calm face, and realized the game had only just begun, signs of a crown and a price on her head. The ship Kestrel drifted through the belt, where asteroids floated like bones of forgotten giants. Jack sat in the pilot chair, eyes fixed on the nav screen, while Lyra moved beside him, checking readings with the quiet focus of someone born for command. The light from the console painted her silver eyes brighter, and Jax could not shake the thought that she did not belong in chains or on a ship held together by weld scars. She belonged to something older and higher than this life of rust and fuel fumes. She spoke rarely, but when she did, every word carried weight. She asked him how far until they reached the nearest safe station. Jack said 3 days if the engines behaved and luck stayed on their side. She nodded and returned to her shard, which glowed faintly like a living thing. Jax could not resist scanning the shard again when she left the cockpit. He knew it was foolish, curiosity that always cost him later. The scanner flared white and a crest appeared for a heartbeat, a circle of wings around a starburst symbol. He frowned and leaned closer. He remembered seeing that symbol once in a news burst playing on a cantina, screen back on Breaker's Key. It was the royal seal of the Seraphine Dominion, one of the oldest alien dynasties in the quadrant. The image vanished before he could capture it. The console hissed and rebooted. Jax sat back, heart pounding. Lyra returned, and saw the screen still flickering. She said nothing at first, but her shoulders stiffened. He told her the truth, that he had scanned her charm. She sighed, and took the shard in both hands as if it were more than metal. She said the words calmly. "Without drama, I am Princess Lyra Valen, heir to House Valen. My uncle rules as regent until I am declared dead or returned to the throne." Jack stared, unable to believe it. He said she must be joking because no royal would end up sold in a cage. She answered that her uncle had staged her death during a border visit when she uncovered his trade in slaves and weapons. The regent was selling his own people to fund a war disguised as peacekeeping. She escaped with the proof stored in the shard. But her guard was killed and her ship taken. She had hidden among traders and scavengers until the bounty hunters found her again. Jax rubbed his jaw, trying to process the idea that the girl he freed was worth more than his entire species. He asked why she told him. She said, because he had earned the truth by treating her as a person, not as property, and because she needed his help to reach the Dominion core where the proof could be shown to the High Council. He laughed once, not because it was funny, but because it sounded impossible. Humans were barely tolerated in Dominion space. They were seen as upstarts and scavengers, useful for labor, but not politics. He told her this plan would get them both killed. She looked at him and said, "Death is better than slavery." The silence that followed was heavy. The hum of the engines filled it like a heartbeat. Jax finally said he would take her as far as the border, and then she could find someone with more power. She thanked him, but he saw. In her eyes she knew he would not abandon her. He had the same sickness every human captain caught once, pride, the kind that would not let him walk away from a fight that mattered. By the second day, bounty alerts filled the outer channels. Messages described a human ship matching Kestrel, offering high reward, dead or alive. Lyra watched the feeds with a steady face. Jax cursed the speed of the hunters. They would find them within hours if they did not jump fast. He rerouted through a field dense with rock debris, dangerous for anyone without nerves of steel. Lyra offered to help with navigation. She adjusted the ship's thrusters and marked a route that cut their travel time in half. Jax asked how she knew the path. She smiled faintly and Said her tutors once made her study the ancient trade lanes of her ancestors, and those old routes still worked when newer ones were watched. They moved through the field like ghosts. The ship shuddered under pressure, but Lyra handled the calculations. Like she was born among stars, Jax began to respect her, not as a royal or a symbol, but as a pilot beside him. She was different from the nobles he had met at ports who treated humans like tools. She asked him about Earth, and he told her stories of oceans and mountains she had never seen. She listened as if she could see them through his eyes and said, one day she wanted to visit the planet that raised people who still believed in honor. Jax said Earth did not raise him, the belt did, hard and cold. She said then the belt raised a good man when they cleared the field. Sensors lit again. 3 ships appeared behind them, sleek and black with Dominion codes but no transponders. Jax knew what that meant. Bounty hunters. Hired by the Regent, Lyra gripped the shard and said if they captured her, they would destroy the proof. Jax told her not to worry, because humans had a rule: you do not catch what you cannot corner. He gunned the engines and dived toward a cluster of asteroids. The Kestrel twisted through narrow cracks, thrusters flaring. The hunters fired plasma bursts that carved fire across rock, but Jax flew like the ship was part of him. Lyra watched without fear, helping him count distance and drift together. They moved like one mind. After an hour, the chase ended. One hunter ship crashed into an asteroid, another lost power from its own weapon backfire. The last turned away when Jax looped around and aimed his mining laser at its engines. He did not shoot, because he never killed unless he had to. The hunter fled trailing smoke. Jax let out a long breath. Lyra smiled faintly and said, now she understood why humans were feared, not for their numbers or weapons, but for their will. They hid in the shadow of a moon while systems cooled. Lyra patched a crack in the coolant line with surprising skill. She said she had learned engineering from palace staff who built ships for the royal fleet. Jax watched her hands steady and sure. He wondered how someone, raised in silk, could handle tools with such grace. She looked at him and said softly, we are not so different. You and I, both prisoners of our choices. He did not answer because she was right. That night, while she rested, he sent a private message to an old friend, Cole Vega, a retired Marine who owed him a favor. He told him he needed backup and safe passage through the next sector. He did not say why, only that it was for something that mattered. Cole replied with 2 words, I'm in. Jax leaned back and stared at the stars, thinking about how strange life could be. One moment you take a slave as payment, and the next you are carrying a princess with a bounty on her head, and maybe the fate of a whole empire in your hands. He laughed quietly, and muttered to himself that humans really were fools for lost causes, but maybe that was why they survived. Lyra woke and joined him at the viewport. The stars reflected in her eyes like fire. She said, thank you for not giving me away. He said, thank you for fixing my nav core. She smiled and said, we will make a good team. He did not argue because for the first time in years he believed it. They had no army, no plan, and no place to hide. But they had each other, and that was enough to start a war, with destiny itself a crew that says no to chains. The stars outside the viewport stretched into lines as the Kestrel jumped through the cold, dark Jax. Mercer sat at the control panel thinking about how far he had fallen, or maybe how far he had climbed. Depending on the light, he had started this week as a broke salvager, and now he was the accidental protector of an alien princess who carried the proof of a crime that could shatter an empire. He looked over at Lyra, who sat quiet but awake, studying star maps she had drawn from memory. Her silver eyes reflected the glow of the console, and Jax could not help but feel that this woman carried both sorrow and strength in equal measure. She looked like someone who had seen her world burn and had chosen to build again instead of turning away. He respected that he respected her. They reached a small station hidden between 2 dead moons. It was an old mining depot converted into a black market hub where anyone could disappear if they knew the right codes. Jax had friends here, not many, but enough to get supplies and information. He sent a coded ping to Cole Vega, the old Marine who once saved his life during the asteroid riots. Cole arrived in a worn shuttle, his face lined with years of hard choices and harder truths. He greeted Jax with a smirk and a handshake that could break steel. When Jax introduced Lyra, Cole blinked once at her strange eyes and then nodded without question. Jax told him the story, stripped of titles, and Crown saying only that the girl had proof of a corruption ring that reached into the heart of the Dominion, and that they needed to get her to safety. Cole listened without interruption, then said the simple words, "Sounds like we are doing the right thing, and right things are never easy." They needed more than 2 people to pull this off, so Jax called May Armitage a coder and signal thief who could make an entire sector go blind with one virus. May was small, sharp, and always smiling, as if she knew a joke no one else did. She owed Jax from a past job where he pulled her out of a collapsing relay tower. She joined without hesitation. When she met Lyra, she bowed in an exaggerated gesture and said, "Your Highness, I promise to break every law. In your name." Lyra laughed for the first time since Jax had met her, and it sounded like music after years of silence. They also brought on Dr. Hana Okoro, a medic from Earth who worked in the outer colonies patching up miners for scraps. Hana had lost her family to a slaver raid, and when she heard what Lyra carried, she packed her medkit and said quietly, "I have been waiting to fight this war for a long time." The crew of 4 became 5, and the ship, Kestrel, felt alive for the first time in years. They repaired panels, painted slogans on the inner walls, and rebuilt the engines from scrap. Lyra insisted on helping and refused to sit idle. She worked alongside them, learning human jokes and slang. She ate canned rations without complaint, and when Cole teased her about royal manners, she threw a wrench at him, laughing. Jax watched them all and thought, maybe this was what hope looked like in real life. Not banners or speeches, just people choosing to stand together. Lyra showed them what the shard could do when connected to the ship's data core. A holographic map filled the air showing trade routes, slave ships, payment trails, and coded transmissions, all leading back to one name, Regent Corin Valen, her uncle. The proof was clear, undeniable. May's eyes went wide, and she said this data could set the whole sector on fire. Lyra said that was the plan. Jax asked how they could reach the Dominion core. Where the High Council met, Lyra pointed to a small mark on the map, a hidden vault called the Seraph Spindle, buried beneath an ice moon where the royal archives were kept. She said if they could access that vault, they could broadcast the records to every major world at once, and no one could silence the truth. Cole called it suicide. Hana called it justice. Jax called it both and decided they would try because humans had a reputation to keep. They always said humans were stubborn too, emotional, too reckless, and he wanted to prove them right because those flaws were the reason humanity survived among empires that saw them as lesser. They left the station before dawn and slipped into dark space. The bounty on Lyra's head had doubled, and hunters prowled every lane. They traveled under fake codes, changing transponder signatures. May hacked comm networks to make the ship appear as a cargo hauler, bound for the outer moons. One night, while the others slept, Jax sat alone with a bottle of cheap whiskey, staring at the stars. Lyra joined him, wrapped in a blanket. She said softly, "My people think humans are dangerous because they fight for each other even when they gain nothing." Jax said that was because they remember what it means to be hungry and free. She smiled and said, "Then maybe that is what my world needs to learn." Their first test came 2 days later when a patrol frigate hailed them, demanding identity codes. May's hack failed halfway through, and alarms lit the deck. The frigate locked weapons. Jax shouted for everyone to brace, and threw the ship into a spiral dive through a meteor cloud. Cole manned the turret with steady aim, blasting rocks to create cover. Hana strapped in and treated a wounded pipe that had burst. Lyra took the co-pilot seat and read the meteor pattern faster than the sensors could. She guided Jax through gaps narrower than the ship's wings. The frigate followed, but the rocks tore its hull open and forced it to retreat. They escaped by the edge of an asteroid ring, engines bleeding, but alive. When it was over, they sat in the dim light, breathing hard. Cole laughed and said, "Next time, remind me to stay retired." Jax replied, "You tried that once and got bored." May clapped her hands and said, "We just outran a Dominion frigate with duct tape and hope. Humans 1, aliens 0. Lyra smiled faintly and said, "You risked your lives for me." Jax answered, "No. We risked our lives for what you stand for." That night they held a small meal in the mess hall. Simple food, warm air, and shared stories. Cole spoke about battles he never wanted to fight again. Hana talked about patients who had nothing but still shared everything. May told a joke so bad that even Lyra laughed until tears ran down her cheeks. For a moment, they were not rebels or fugitives. They were a family built on choice, not birth. When silence returned, Lyra stood and said, "Thank you to all of them." She said she would not forget that when the galaxy turned its face away, humans turned toward her. Jax raised his cup and said, "Then let the galaxy watch, because we are not done yet." The crew cheered quietly, knowing louder would break the fragile peace. Outside the viewport, the stars turned cold and sharp, and the kestrel flew onward into the dark, toward the ice moon, and the truth waiting below. None of them knew how the story would end, but each of them had already decided that whatever happened, they would never again be the kind of people who watched others fall into chains and did nothing about it. They would fight together, and if they fell, they would fall standing. Betrayal at Sapphire Spindle. The ice moon, called Sapphire Spindle, floated in the dark, like a shard of glass turning slow and silent in the shadow of its giant planet. It was a place of old wealth and quiet power where the Dominion stored its records in vaults buried deep under frozen oceans. Jax Mercer watched the moon grow larger through the viewport of Kestrel and felt a cold weight settle in his stomach. He had flown through storms, asteroid fields, and battles, but nothing chilled him like the idea of walking into a city ruled by people who thought themselves gods. He looked at Lyra, who stood beside him, her silver eyes reflecting the pale glow of the moon. She was calm, but he could see tension in the line of her shoulders. She was going home, but not to welcome arms. They landed in the docking bay of the Capitol Tower, where guards in white armor waited. Their leader introduced himself as Magistrate Varduran, a tall man with a soft voice and a smile that never reached his eyes. He greeted Lyra with a bow deeper than needed and said it was an honor to receive her and her human escort. He promised safe passage and access to the archives, but Jax did not like the way the man's gaze lingered on the shard Lyra held hidden beneath her cloak. Still, they had no other way in, so Jax swallowed his doubt and nodded. Inside the tower, the air smelled of cold metal and expensive perfume. Walls shimmered with holograms of Dominion heroes, all of them looking down with judgment. Jax felt out of place in his scuffed boots and patched jacket, but Lyra walked as if she owned the floor which she once had. Cole stayed close hand near his weapon. May carried a portable jammer hidden in her coat, and Hana moved like a shadow, watching every guard. They were led to a suite overlooking the frozen plains and told to rest until the archives opened in the morning. The moment the door closed, Jax turned to Lyra and said, "This feels wrong." She agreed quietly, saying the magistrate's courtesy was too polished, too rehearsed. May began scanning the room and found 6 hidden recorders and 2 transmitters. She disabled them with quick hands. Cole swore softly and said, "They should have stayed on the ship." Jax said they had come too far to turn back now. Night fell and the city outside glowed blue and white, with energy lines running across the ice towers rose like teeth biting at the sky. Jax stood by the window, watching the movement of patrol drones when he heard footsteps behind him. Lyra joined him and said softly that this was where she was meant to rule. Once she pointed to the distant palace spire shining above all others. Her uncle sat there now, calling himself protector of peace. She said she used to believe he loved her, but power changes love into hunger. Jax looked at her and said, "Not if you choose to stay human." She smiled faintly and said, "Then maybe I should learn from you at dawn." The magistrate arrived with guards and escorts. He told them the archives were ready. They followed him down a long glass corridor that spiraled into the heart of the moon. Jax felt his nerves tightening. He saw guards ahead closing doors behind them, one by one. When the corridor ended, they entered a chamber lined with crystalline pillars. The magistrate turned and his polite mask fell. He said he was sorry, but business demanded loyalty to the regent's soldiers raised rifles before anyone could draw. Jax lunged forward, but a stun bolt hit him in the chest and he went down. Cole roared and took 2 men with him before a shock baton dropped him. May tried to trigger her jammer, but a guard kicked it away. Hana reached for her medkit as if it could save them all. Lyra shouted for them to stop, but her voice was drowned by the hum of energy cuffs locking around their wrists. The magistrate walked to her with mock regret and said, Your uncle will pay well for your return, and even more. For the proof you stole. Lyra's eyes turned cold as ice. She said you will not live to spend his coin. He smiled, thin and cruel, saying, I have no need to live long when paid enough. He ordered her separated from the humans. Jack struggled to move, but the shock made his limbs heavy. He shouted her name as they dragged her away. She turned once and said, do not give up. Then she was gone. Hours passed, or maybe days. Jax could not tell. He woke in a cell with Cole. May and Hannah bruised and silent. The air smelled of frost and metal. May whispered that the shard was still active somewhere in the building. She had linked it to her pad before they were caught and could trace its signal if they escaped. Cole said, then we escape. Jax stared at the locked door and said, easier said than done, but his voice carried fire again because Lyra's words had burned into him. He had failed once before long ago when slavers took a colony right under his watch, and he had done nothing he would not fail again. They worked in silence. May hacked the cuffs using sparks from a wall conduit. Hannah treated their burns with what little she had. Cole pried a loose panel from the floor, using brute strength. When the last wire snapped, the door slid open, slow and quiet. They slipped out into the corridor, moving like ghosts. The halls were empty, the guards distracted by something above. When they reached a terminal, May checked the signal and found Lyra's location deep below the tower in a chamber, marked interrogation. Lyra sat chained to a chair, her face calm as the Regent's hologram flickered before her. His voice filled the room, smooth and cold. He told her she had caused enough trouble and that mercy was not infinite. She replied that mercy without justice was corruption. He warned her that her death would bring peace. She said, then let peace taste blood for once, because I will not beg. Jax and his crew reached the chamber as the hologram faded. He burst through the door with Cole at his side, guns blazing. The guards fell fast and Lyra looked up surprised but unbroken. Jax freed her and said, time to leave, princess. She smiled and said, I told you not to give up. They fought their way through the corridors, alarms screaming. May hacked the lifts. Hannah threw stun grenades made from med supplies, and Cole carried Lyra when she stumbled. They reached the hangar where Kestrel waited, scarred but ready. The magistrate stood there with a squad and a detonator in his hand. E shouted that no one would leave alive. Jax walked forward without fear and said, you sold people for comfort. How much do you think your soul is worth? The man sneered and pressed the trigger, but May had already jammed the signal. The bomb failed. Jax punched him once hard enough to drop him. Lyra took the detonator and crushed it in her palm. They took off under fire engines roaring. The ice moon fell away behind them as explosions lit the tower. The magistrate's betrayal had bought them time and chaos. The vault still lay below untouched, but now they knew where it was and what it held, proof enough to bring down a throne. Lyra stood in the cockpit watching the flames and whispered, this is not the end. Jax answered, no, this is just where we start fighting back, the heist that breaks the collar. The ship Kestrel burned through the cold void, leaving the shattered towers of sapphire spindle behind. Like broken teeth against the dark, Lyra sat near the forward viewport, her silver eyes fixed on the trail of smoke rising from the moon below. Jax Mercer stood beside her, running through new coordinates and old regrets. He had risked everything to get her out, and now they had the location of the Seraph Vault, where the Regent kept the records that proved his crimes. The problem was the vault lay under the Dominion capital where the Regent had an army, and they had only one ship, a few guns, and the kind of courage that borders on madness. Jax looked at his crew and thought, maybe that was enough. Cole Vega cleaned his rifle in the corner, humming a war tune that had no words, just a rhythm that kept his hands steady. Hana Okoro checked the medical supplies, counting every bandage and stim as if numbers could make up for luck. May Armitage leaned over the console, fingers flying across keys, pulling fragments of Dominion network codes together like a puzzle. She said the vault security rotated every 12 hours, meaning they had one chance to slip in before the next lockdown. Jack said, then we move fast before they even know we are still alive. Lyra turned from the window, her voice calm but sharp, saying, we cannot just steal the data. We must show it to everyone at once, or the Regent will bury the truth again. They spent the next 3 days planning every detail. May drew maps from stolen files, Cole studied guard patterns, Hannah modified medkits into smoke bombs, and Lyra used her royal codes to open doors that no one else could even see. They decided to enter during the mid-cycle market rush when thousands of workers flooded the capital corridors. The plan was simple in words, impossible in practice. They would disguise themselves as technicians, slip into the power conduit under the archive, reach the vault through maintenance shafts, extract the data onto portable drives, and upload it to every public channel using May's signal towers. It was half a plan and half a prayer, but humans were good at making prayers work. On the day of the heist, the capital shimmered under twin suns. The streets were full of drones, merchants, and guards. Lyra wore a worker's cloak. Her posture bent low. Jax walked beside her carrying a tool case. Cole and Hannah followed with crates of fake equipment, while May moved ahead linking jammers to every relay post they passed. They reached the lower corridors without drawing attention. The hum of the city above was replaced by the cold sound of machines humming beneath the surface. The walls here were old-lined, with frost and steel. The air smelled of coolant and power. At the junction, May knelt and connected her pad to the grid. She whispered that the security feed was looping for the next 10 minutes. Jax nodded and led them through a maintenance tunnel so narrow they had to crawl. Lyra moved behind him, silent and steady. When they reached the vault door, it looked nothing like he expected. It was not a door at all, but a smooth wall that rippled like water when Lyra touched the shard to it. A pulse of light spread through the metal and the wall opened, revealing a chamber filled with crystals glowing faint blue. Each crystal was a record, a life, a transaction frozen in data light. The vault of truth stood before them. Lyra walked to the central console and placed the shard into a slot. The room responded like a living thing. The crystals flickered and rearranged, forming a map of trade routes and payment trails leading back to the regent's throne. The proof was undeniable. May's eyes widened as streams of data poured across her screen. She copied everything onto 3 drives for safety. Hannah whispered that they should hurry because security would notice the energy spike soon. Then the alarm began. It was not a sound, but a vibration that rattled the bones. Jax shouted for everyone to move. Guards flooded the corridor, shouting orders. Cole opened fire with controlled bursts, taking down the first wave. May smashed her pad into the console, forcing a final upload. Lyra pulled the shard free and the vault lights flared white. They ran through smoke and sparks. Jax led the way, firing blind to cover their retreat. Hannah threw a smoke bomb that filled the hall with thick gray mist. They reached the surface level as chaos erupted across the city. May's virus hit every channel, broadcasting the regent's crimes in every language across every system. The images of slave markets and secret payments filled the skies on holographic screens. People stopped in the streets, staring in shock. The truth spread faster than any army could march. Lyra stood on the steps of the archive, her cloak torn, her face streaked with soot. She spoke into a transmitter, her voice echoing through the broadcast. She said, "I am Lyra Valen, daughter of House Valen, and I bring witness that the regent has sold our people and our honor for gold and power." The crowd gasped. Some knelt. Others shouted. Her words turned fear into fire. The regent's soldiers surrounded the plaza, but they hesitated. The people were no longer silent. Jack stood beside her, weapon in hand, ready to fight, but Lyra raised her arm and said, "Not yet, let them choose." The soldiers looked at each other, uncertain. Then one dropped his rifle, another turned away, and soon half the formation stepped back, refusing to fire. The regent's command screamed over the comms, but discipline broke like glass under hammer. Cole grabbed Jax and said, "The palace guards are coming heavy. We need to move now." Jax nodded and pulled Lyra toward the waiting Kestrel. They ran through alleys while drones fired from above. The ship roared to life under May's control. Hannah covered them from the ramp using a scavenged turret. Jax lifted off under heavy fire. The city below burned with light and rebellion. In the sky, Dominion cruisers descended, blocking escape routes. Cole cursed and said, "We can't fight them all." Lyra said, "We don't have to fight them. We just have to survive long enough for the people to see the truth." She linked the shard to the ship's transmitter and sent the proof again, this time to every known system across the sector. There was no way to erase it now. The Kestrel took hits but kept flying. Jax dodged plasma bursts that turned the air into rivers of light. Coal kept firing until the barrels melted. May rerouted power from life support to engines. Hana strapped Lyra in when the gravity field flickered. The cruiser lines tightened like a cage, but before they could close, a fleet of small civilian ships rose from the surface, miners, traders, and workers flying whatever could move. They formed a wall around Kestrel, blocking the cruisers with their own hulls. A voice came through the comm. It was one of the dock workers from Sapphire Spindle, saying, "We owe you one human." The fleet opened a path. Jax punched the engines and the Kestrel tore through the gap, leaving the capital shrinking behind them. The comms filled with voices shouting freedom for the Dominion. Lyra watched in silence as tears filled her eyes. Jax looked at her and said, "You just lit a fire that no one can put out." She turned to him and said, "No, we lit it together." We're at the edge of the vault. The fire of rebellion had spread through the Dominion like a storm. No fleet could contain cities that had knelt to the regent, now burned with his banners torn and trampled on the streets. The proof May Armitage had released could not be silenced. It crossed every relay station and pirate channel until even children in the mining colonies spoke the name of Lyra Valen and the crimes of her uncle. The regent called it human treachery and ordered every loyal ship to hunt down the Kestrel and its crew. He filled the sky with his war cruisers, but the truth had already done more damage than any weapon could. Jax Mercer watched the chaos unfold through the static feed, his hands tight on the controls while the hum of the engines echoed like a heartbeat inside the hull. He had seen revolutions before, but never one started by a handful of people and a broken freighter. Lyra stood behind him, her face pale but her voice strong. She said, "The regent will not stop until he buries me." And every witness, Jax said then, "We will dig ourselves out and bury him instead." She smiled faintly and said, "The people believe now that is enough to start, but not enough to finish. We must hold until the council sees the truth with their own eyes." She explained that the Seraph Vault had another layer hidden beneath the archives, an ancient defense system linked to the Dominion satellites, a weapon left from the first age of expansion. It was called the Celestial Grid, and it could destroy fleets or protect entire worlds depending on who controlled it. The access key was part of the shard she carried, and it could only be activated by a living heir. Jax stared at her and said, "That means you?" Lyra nodded and said quietly, "It also means if the grid fails, the feedback will burn through whoever is connected to it." The Kestrel descended into orbit above the vault world where the final stand would take place. Below them, the ice cracked with lightning as enemy ships landed and soldiers poured out like a flood. Cole Vega checked his rifle and grinned like an old wolf. He said, "I always wanted to go out in a fight worth dying for." May rerouted power to the shields while Hana Okoro prepared the infirmary, knowing it would soon overflow. The people of the nearby cities had risen too. Miners, farmers, traders, all carrying scavenged weapons. They sent messages to Lyra calling her their Queen of Truth. She told them not to bow but to stand. The first wave of the regent's assault came at dawn. His ships filled the sky with fire raining plasma that turned crown, clean hands, and a human promise. The war was over, but the silence that followed was heavier than the noise that came before. The vault world hung scarred and cracked beneath a pale sun, where the ice had melted into rivers that glowed with strange light. The Kestrel rested on a plain of glass that used to be snow, and around it the people built fires from the wrecks of broken ships. The air smelled of metal and smoke, but also of hope. Jax Mercer stood outside the ship staring at the horizon, where the last of the regent's fleet had fled into the black. He felt no triumph, only a quiet relief that the worst had passed. Lyra Valen stood beside him, her cloak torn, her silver eyes softer now than they had ever been. She had lived through fire and grief and still carried herself like someone who would not bend. She had connected to the celestial grid and called down the defense satellites when all seemed lost. She had turned the sky into a storm of light and shattered the regent's fleet before his ships could burn the cities again. Many had died for that moment, but their sacrifice had saved billions. The people called her queen, and sang her name across every system that the Dominion held. She had not wanted the title yet. The council demanded she take it. The proof of the regent's betrayal had burned through the network so completely that no noble dared defend him anymore. He had fled beyond the rim, chased by bounty hunters and vengeance. The Dominion needed a ruler, one who could rebuild what was broken, and Lyra was the only one they trusted. Jax told her he would stand by her as long as she needed, but he was no courtman and no hero of marble statues. She laughed and said he was both, because heroes were just people who kept standing when everyone else fell. The coronation took place in the great amphitheater carved from the ice itself. The banners of 100 worlds hung in the wind, but beside them stood the old blue and white flag of Earth carried by Kolvega and Hana Okoro. In honor of their lost crew, May Armitage broadcast the ceremony live across every channel she could reach, and for the first time in Dominion history, humans and aliens watched the same screen for the same reason, the me. People cheered as Lyra walked to the center wearing armor instead of silk. Her voice carried without machines when she swore her oath. She said, "I take no slaves, I hold no chains. I wear no crown that sits upon the necks of others." Her words rolled across the crowd like thunder, and even the oldest nobles bowed their heads. When the crown of light touched her brow, the celestial grid pulsed in orbit, aligning to her heartbeat, the defense satellites recognizing her as rightful ruler. The network had once been used for war. Now it became a shield that covered every world under her care. Lyra's first act as queen was to end the slave trade forever. She called every name from the records of the vault and declared them citizens free with compensation from the regent's frozen accounts. She outlawed private prisons and indenture contracts. She signed the papers with a pen forged from melted slave collars and placed them in a museum behind glass with a single inscription, "Never again." The days that followed were filled with rebuilding. The miners repaired the vault structures, the traders reopened the lanes, and the soldiers laid down arms. Jax stayed with the Kestrel running supplies between cities while Lyra learned to rule. From the ashes, she trusted no courtier who had served the regent, and instead filled her council with commoners and veterans. Cole became her defense advisor. Though he still preferred to sleep on the ship, Hana took charge of a new medcorps that treated anyone regardless of species. May became the quiet ghost in the wires, protecting the networks from the shadows. Each of them carried scars, but they carried them with pride because those scars were proof of what they had done and who they had saved. One evening after weeks of repair, Jax found Lyra alone on a balcony overlooking the ice fields. The sky was clear for the first time since the battle, and the stars reflected in the glass below. He asked if she missed the person she was before all of this. She said she missed the simplicity but not the silence, because silence had allowed evil to thrive. She turned to him and said, "Do you know why I told you the truth back on Breaker's Key?" Jax said, "Because I was too stubborn to sell you." Lyra smiled and said, "Because I saw a human who refused to treat me as less, and I knew that if my people learned that kind of strength, we might finally deserve to rule." Jax said, "Humans are just too foolish to quit." She said, "Then May, we all stay foolish forever." The next morning, Lyra met with the Dominion Council for the first time as queen. They tried to flatter her to steer her decisions, but she saw through them like glass. She told them the Dominion would no longer be ruled by fear or greed. She said every world would have a voice, every child would have a future, and if they disagreed, they were free to leave. Power was not a throne to cling to, but a fire to share. The council sat in stunned silence, then one by one they agreed because they had no other choice. Later that day, she walked with Jax through the restored market of the capital. The people bowed, but she told them not to. She said bowing belongs to the past. One child ran up and handed her a carved toy of the Kestrel, saying, "My father says humans saved us." She knelt and told the child that humans and aliens saved each other because that was what made them all people. Not blood, not crowns, but the choice to care. Jax watched and felt something in his chest that was not pride or sorrow, but both at once. That night, as the sun set twin on the horizon, a festival filled the streets. Lanterns of ice and fire floated into the sky, each one carrying a name of someone who had fallen. Lyra held one with Renz named the scientist who had died activating the first network and whispered a promise that his sacrifice would never be forgotten. The crowd sang old songs from 100 worlds while fireworks painted the air. Jack stood with his crew and, for the first time in years, he felt peace. May raised a drink to the stars, Cole laughed loud and rough. Hannah smiled and said we did it. Not for reward, not for glory, but because it needed to be done. When the lights dimmed and the city slept, Jax returned, to the Kestrel planning to leave before dawn. He had never stayed anywhere long and he thought this time would be no different. But when Lyra found him loading supplies, she asked if he was running again. He said, not running, just drifting. She handed him a new star map marked with routes of trade and alliance all under her seal. She said, then drift for me. Explore, teach. Remind them what humanity means. He took the map and nodded. She said softly, you will always have a home here. And he answered, and you will always have a friend out there. The engines of the Kestrel roared one last time as it lifted from the capital port. The crowd waved and the Queen stood among them, her hand raised high. The ship climbed through the thin clouds and vanished into the stars, carrying the story of how a human salvager accepted an alien slave as payment and discovered instead a princess who changed the galaxy. The tale spread through every corner of known space, told in markets and schools and war camps, as a reminder that freedom is the only treasure worth fighting for, and that humanity's strength was never in power or numbers, but in the simple, stubborn promise to never let another soul live in chains. The legend ended, not with an empire won, but with a friendship that rewrote the stars and a message whispered across time and space. Humanity gets knocked down yet rises again, not for glory but for each other, and as long as one human heart still beats, the light of freedom will never fade.